This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 47 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Do you know that next week it will be an entire year since I began broadcasting the Thoughtful Travel Podcast? It feels like a year that's gone very quickly, but at the same time I can't imagine my life without the Thoughtful Travel Podcast in it. So big shout out and huge thank you to those of you who've been listening right from the start or close to the start. I hope you've enjoyed it even a fraction as much as I've enjoyed making it. And anyway, today we're getting onto a topic of taking tours on your travels. Now, I kind of recoil a little bit when I think about the topic of tours, and I think that many of you do too. I did a quick shout out in my Facebook group for thoughtful travellers about their opinions on tours, and as I expected, most people were okay, maybe sometimes under, particular circumstances, maybe I might. And I'll give some more feedback from those listeners as we go along today. But on the whole, I think thoughtful travellers tend not to use tours, but there's definitely a time and place for them, which we'll talk about today. For myself, I have long been quite anti-tour. I guess when I was a kid and we went to Europe, when we camper vanned around for 6 months, we definitely didn't take any tours. I guess we were travelling independently to start with, and our budget was pretty low to be able to stretch it for that 6 months. So perhaps that meant we didn't ever bother trying any tours. But that meant that I was kind of brought up not using them, and that's not the way you travel. And then I always remember in my early 20s, probably I was 20, 21 or so, and a good friend of mine had moved over to Sydney. We went to visit him. And for some reason we took a bus tour, a day trip to the Snowy Mountains. And the rest of the people on the tour were, different to me, I suppose. And then worst of all, the friend that I'd gone to visit was gay, and the driver/tour guide guy, halfway through the day, for no apparent reason, started telling these homophobic jokes over the microphone as we drove along, and everyone laughed. And so I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I mean, maybe if it was now, I would have got up and punched him instead. Not that I advocate violence, but anyway, that sort of was burned into my memory as what a tour is like. And so I just never wanted to do one again. But I think there is a time and a place, which we'll talk about more today. And my first guest today is Natasha Lester. You might remember she very wisely picks fabulous cities abroad to set her novels in. So she then does research trips. And as part of these research trips, she sometimes booked some special tours. And that's what we chat about today.
Yeah, the other really interesting thing I did when I went to Paris last year is, and I did it again in New York last year, is I booked some private tours, which I hadn't done the first time I went to New York back in 2013. And I've got to say that was the most amazing experience, having a local sort of, the guides that I had were historians, and so because I write historical fiction, so it's always the history stuff that's important to me. And so they were able to, you walk through an area like the Marais district in Paris, and so you can see that all these buildings are really old and have been there for a long time, but having a private tour guide, they're able to tell you the story behind the building and to show you places that you would have otherwise walked past and not known were important or interesting. We were wandering through the Palais Royal on our way through to Paris's historical fashion district, and there was this guy sweeping his restaurant outside his kind of al fresco dining area, and she went up to him and she chatted to him, and she knew him, and it turned out that he holds the keys to the Theatre du Palais Royal, which was upstairs from his restaurant.
Wow.
And so he said, she asked if she could take me up there to look at the theatre, and he said yes. So we went up to this beautiful, amazing, intimate theatre that, is a couple of 100 years old and is just the most stunning space. I didn't even know it existed, would never have gone there otherwise, but now it's in my book because it's the perfect place for a couple of scenes in my book to take place. And so having the private tour guide enabled me to find things that I didn't know existed and have made all the difference to the book. So that was fabulous.
Oh, that's magical, isn't it? Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, a private tour, especially one that's sort of slanted to your particular interest, whatever your interest is, whether it's history or something else, would just really enhance the way you see and understand a place that you're visiting. How cool.
Yeah, oh, it's great. And she took me into an atelier, so a fashion workroom that, again, has been there for about 300 years. It's been a family business that was handed down from the great-great-grandfather to the great-grandfather and so on down to the son now who's running it. And, so we had access to watching these women working. And again, when you're watching someone do the work, the detail that you're able to write about and put into your book is so different to just kind of reading about it on Google or something like that. And once again, it's just snapping photos. That's the biggest thing I do, is I take hundreds of photos of everything so that later when I'm sitting at my desk, I can go back and look at what were the steps that these women went through in order to make this. They were making silk flowers to go on couture dresses. Yeah, so that was great. So again,
then you can describe it in accurate detail or pick out the details that work for your book. And,
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, I think it's a great idea. And I think it's also very wise of you to choose excellent destinations for your novels. So, I mean, settings, sorry, not destinations. Yeah, no,
I agree. I mean, WA has some very exciting, lovely places too, but it's hard to beat Paris.
Yes, it's funny. I haven't seen you setting a novel in Kalgoorlie or something.
Not yet. But you never know.
No, you never know. But still, if I were you, I would stick to these kind of cities too.
Yeah.
I really love the idea of doing private tours with people who have a special particular knowledge, like the historian guides that Natasha used. That would just be a really amazing way to get under the skin of a place, especially if you've got a particular hobby or interest, be it, I don't know, music or art or something, and to be able to really talk to an expert about that topic. You would definitely learn things that you would never find out just by sitting at home. Now, my next guest today is Rachael Johns, who is another Perth novelist, and we chatted for quite some time about this issue, and I've got some highlights from our talk coming up. Especially we talked about the pros and cons of taking small tours versus just sort of wandering around a place doing local stuff, and definitely there's a time and a place for both.
I definitely would recommend going on tours in any place, because it's the tour guides who tell you they told us ghost stories of things that I weaved into the book, about some of the most haunted restaurants and things like that. And so, it's the tour guides or the people that really know the locals, I suppose, as well. Saying that, I also think it's good to see when you go somewhere to not necessarily experience the touristy side of it. I also went to New York a year ago, probably about, and I have used New York in a book since. I never went there again. I didn't decide to go there for that reason.
Yeah, sure.
But the interesting thing is luckily I went with someone who'd been there before, so I think that was very useful too, because I felt like she could be, my guide, sort of a guide. I didn't have to worry about, working out where streets were or how to catch subways and stuff. Yeah, I think that was very useful. But one thing that we actually didn't do was do the touristy things. I didn't go up the Empire State Building. We did the most touristy thing we did was probably walk across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh, yes.
And Broadway. We went to Broadway. I love, So I think, sometimes experiencing a place, not doing the touristy things, but choosing to do some things that just everyday people who live in that city would do.
Yes.
Can be really good. I suppose it depends why you're going there.
Yeah, and probably on the city to some extent, perhaps. But yeah, I agree with New York City. I went there. I've only spent less than a week there, and I'm dying to go back at some stage. But I did quite a few of the touristy things. But the things that stand out most for me are things like we're sitting in a coffee shop, just, having a break and having something to drink. And at the next table, there was clearly a group of screenwriters arguing about what they were going to do with their TV series and stuff like that. And I thought, this is so New York. And, that's getting into the everyday kind of life of it. So
yeah, and don't get me wrong, I would have liked to have seen more of the touristy stuff anyway, but like you, we were there for a conference and I was only there for a few days.
Yeah.
So, those things I'd like to go back and see. But yeah, just just wandering the streets, I think, and people watching in these places is also, you know, and a lot of the time, I think when you're doing creative things or you're writing, you don't actually realise it at the time, but, you know, a couple of years later it might come into your head again. I'm not a very big note taker. I don't, you know, unless I do specifically go somewhere, which is rare, with the story in mind, I just sort of soak up experiences and hope that something will maybe come.
Well, that's the thing. Sometimes it's then what does stick, like what actually still comes into your mind a year or two later, then it's kind of self-filtered it out and found the most interesting thing for you. So
yeah, that's true, because I've got such a terrible memory these days that if I remember anything, it must be maybe worth remembering or not. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm a bit the same. But it's true. It's a really interesting idea, because I don't think I take enough like really local tours, because I'm so averse to the idea of a tour, you know, and like I'm thinking of like, you know, a Kontiki tour or something like that, because I just hate the idea of that. But you're absolutely right that like once you're in a place, taking a tour with a local who's about a specific kind of topic or something like that is fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It's interesting that you said you don't take many local tours. I mean, I don't know if this is kind of the thing that you usually talk about on your podcast, but a couple of research things I've done that I suppose could loosely be called travel. Yes, actually in WA I went to a whiskey a whiskey brewery that did they taught you how to make whiskey. Obviously they didn't actually teach us, because it's a very long process now. Right. But I did that specifically. It takes a couple of years actually to make whiskey.
Okay.
And I don't even like whiskey, but you know, I went there, and that was, you know, so I think often even tours in your own, you know, backyard can be very useful.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I got sent on one. It's through my blog with a group of British bloggers, but here in Perth.
Oh wow!
It was about the like Indigenous culture, right, like at Elizabeth Quay and right in the centre of Perth, and it was fascinating. And every time I go into town now, I have a completely different appreciation for how it used to be. So
I can imagine that would be really interesting. Yeah, I think it's all about taking up as many opportunities as you can and just grabbing them, you know, when you can.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, you're so right. I should do it more. I mean, when I was in Japan last year, I went to a sake factory and learnt all about how that's produced. So I know all about sake, but I have never been to a local, whiskey or anything like that.
Oh, that would have been really interesting, though. Yeah.
Oh, it was fascinating. Yeah, it was fascinating. They had these massive vats of the rice that they had to stir. And the guy who was leading us through the factory said, "Oh, so where that man is standing now, it's very dangerous. And if he slips and falls into that vat, he will die." And I'm like, I know. I was like, well, let's not distract him too much then. He was like, "It's okay. He's very experienced." And I was like, I was really worried for him, because he didn't look like he was being very careful.
I was going to say, did anyone ask how many people have?
No. No. There was only two of us, and we were obviously both too polite or too scared of the answer.
Funny.
I don't know.
I would have asked.
After speaking with Rachael about my sake factory tour in Japan, I was reminded that I actually did take a full day, well, actually overnight tour in Japan, probably one of the very, very rare times I can remember ever taking a tour that lasted more than a couple of hours. And that time it was to travel from Osaka to Mount Fuji, to climb Mount Fuji. And a group of 4 of us did it. We were all working as teachers in Osaka. And we'd figured out that this bus tour was definitely the most cost-effective way to do it. And I guess we didn't really think it through, because it was actually really a local tour, as in for Japanese people with a Japanese guide. And one of the 4 of us could speak, not me, there was another girl who could speak Japanese relatively fluently. She had one Japanese parent, I think, back in Canada. And so we managed to kind of find out things as we went along. But overnight we climbed Mount Fuji. We got to the top of Fuji for sunrise. And as did, you know, hundreds of other people. And my boyfriend at the time and I had got separated from the other 2 people we'd gone with at some stage, and we never really found them. And we were trying to get back down the mountain according to what we'd understood from the tour guide, who was also nowhere to be seen, about where we should go and where we'd be meeting our bus. And it is possible, just so you know, to get lost on Mount Fuji. And I really still to this day don't exactly know where we went wrong, but we went down perhaps the wrong side. I don't know. But we ended up at a different kind of car park area. and our bus wasn't there. And eventually some kind locals took pity on us, and we were able to provide the name of the company we'd booked with, and they phoned them, etc. And eventually the bus managed to come back and pick us up, but we'd missed out on their visit to the onsen in between. However, that sort of added to my scarring feeling about taking tours, because it was all a bit traumatic at the time. A fun story in retrospect, but at the time I was like, oh, why didn't we just go on our own? Why did we have to take a tour? That's the tour's at fault. Not our lack of Japanese. But anyway, I definitely think my sake factory tour in Japan was much more successful, and we got to have a couple of tastings afterwards as well. That was a fun morning out. And then my final guest today is Emma Mann, and she has an interesting perspective. She's definitely at heart an independent traveller, but because she often travels solo, then as she's got older, she's started to take more tours when she travels, as long as particular conditions are met, I guess.
I think that's why I'm now leaning more towards tours as I'm getting older, because...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I was always anti-tour. So my parents bought me a Kentucky tour for my 18th birthday, and I was supposed to join that just after I got to the UK, and I made it through the first day.
Yeah, I've never tried. I really don't think it would be my thing, so...
They just, like, I was so young that it should have been a good fit, but not for me. Not for me.
Yeah.
And so now when I'm looking at tours, I am looking at the companies that do small groups, all ages, local leaders, local economy building, local... heavy emphasis on local charities, giving back to local communities.
Great, yeah.
Yeah, more responsible, ethical travel.
Yeah.
Which thankfully that is so popular now.
Well, yes, I was going to say, these days there's so much of that it would be easier to find that. And so I guess on those kind of group tours, you're more likely to find people
100%.
Similar to you, and
The trip I did when I met Rhiannon was an overland tour with a company called Kamuka, who are now unfortunately no longer around. And there was a lady on that tour who celebrated her 70th birthday while on the tour.
Lovely.
There was a couple who had just got married, so it was part of their honeymoon. There was me travelling by myself, there was Rhiannon travelling by herself, and there was another girl, Lisa, travelling by herself.
Right.
And then there were two guys that were travelling. They were friends and they were just travelling together, and that was it. So there was me and the two girls, and the two guys kind of hung out because we weren't the married couple, and we were 70. Yeah. But the lady who turned 70, she was just obviously one of those people who's travelled her whole life.
Yes.
And she just got along with everybody.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. She was amazing. And she was the first one up. She was the first one to pitch in for everything. She was...
fabulous.
Yeah.
I love those kind of people. I've got a friend like that who's just travelled nonstop, and she's in her 60s now, and so easy to get along with. And age gap certainly doesn't matter, because we've just got so much in common and so much to talk about.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, so I am finding that you get a much bigger mix of ages, especially I think it's because of the countries that I'm travelling to now that they're deemed... Yes. They're traditionally dangerous countries.
Yeah. Well, it's the kind of place where only more experienced travellers will be going, because, and probably older and slightly wiser.
First overseas trip by yourself without your parents.
Exactly right.
Go through places like Zimbabwe and... with all of the trouble that they have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting to hear about the tours and stuff, because I still have never done any kind of tours, but I can see how that could work.
As well, because it's products that I have to be selling, but I think I would do it anyway.
Interesting. And I can see why. Like, I can see the attraction. So, for sure.
I quite like the companies that give you a local leader from the country that you're in.
Yes.
So when we went to Cambodia, we had a Cambodian guy who was just beautiful. And then when we crossed the border to Vietnam, I went with Intrepid, and we got handed off to another person.
Oh, to like a Vietnamese
lady, yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Which was great, because
that's excellent.
They speak the language. They're from that country. They know all the like cool little places to get 50-cent beers and all of that sort of stuff.
And what I love with things like that, like this last week in Japan, we had because it was a sponsored trip, we had a guide with us. And so she was a local Japanese. Actually, she was a 67-year-old Japanese lady who'd been guiding people for 30 odd years. And she was amazing and had so much experience with so many cultures. So, you know, she told me lots of interesting stories about different people she's met. But also she was the perfect person to ask every question under the sun to. So all of the quirky things about Japan that I've never quite understood, I could just ask her all of those things. And it was wonderful to have that.
She probably loved having you as well, because if you'd lived in Japan and you had all of this experience of Japan and then having that kind of person that, like, there are quirks about every country, but then if you're living in that country, you can't sometimes ask your friends that, like your local friends, about those quirks.
Yes,
you don't want to insult a local custom or.
No, it's a sensitive kind of subject, and I certainly didn't start blasting her with the questions on the first day. But you know, we spent a whole week together, the whole day, every day. So it wasn't long before I started to ask all my questions, and she was very open and just delightful. So I guess the conclusion so far is there is a time and a place for tours. As I said at the start, I asked in the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group about people who are members of that group and their experiences with tours. And pretty much there's an agreement. In fact, several people use the word, I loathe tours, but. So there's always a few exceptions of when it seems much better or more appropriate, or it's okay to take a tour. Joe Bauer, for example, mentioned that he's become a big fan of the Eating Europe food tours. So they're small group tours which take you into non-touristy areas to get some good food and drink. And there's definitely something to be said for that. Getting off the tourist track in terms of food is definitely the way to find out what the locals really eat and to also not pay exorbitant tourist prices. So I agree wholeheartedly with that. Amy also mentioned that she took a fantastic day tour through some islands off Antigua last year, doing snorkeling, caving, seeing wildlife and stuff. And that's the kind of tour that you wouldn't be able to get to most of those places on your own. So without having a tour, it's probably, an otherwise impossible thing to do. So those kind of situations where a tour enables you to get to a place that you can't otherwise reach is great. Stephanie said the same thing. For example, areas where government restrictions stop you. I took a tour to the demilitarised zone between South Korea and North Korea because obviously you can't just rock up there on your own. Gary and Sonia also mentioned that sometimes a tour is a good way, if you're not sure about a place, about, sort of safety, language barriers and stuff, that a tour is a great way to kind of get your feet wet. They mentioned going to Vietnam some years ago on a tour with Intrepid. A lot of people have mentioned Intrepid, I must say. I should look them up more thoroughly, I think. But that's a way that now they feel perfectly happy travelling to Vietnam on their own. So that's another way to do it, I think. Olivia also mentioned some Intrepid tours, and that if it's a place where it's kind of really difficult to find your way around and stuff, then you can kind of relax, have a local guide who really helps you get to know the culture without, you being stressed by all the logistics, which makes a lot of sense. And then quite a few people mentioned free walking tours. Mark Wild from Wild Family Travel and a couple of other people also mentioned taking those free walking tours where the guides live off the tips. So they're really trying to make the tour fantastic, which is a great idea. And I know a few people have recommended the context walking tours to me. I know they have like really expert people with, very specialised knowledge leading them, which I think is a good way to go. And Leslie, who's a lovely lady who's even more obsessed by travel than I am, mentioned that, tours are not normally her thing. And most tours in big buses that she's ever done, like on day trips, have been dreadful. And I think dreadful is exactly the word that springs to my mind as well. But they've just come back from a trip to India where they used a private guide. And she said it wasn't exorbitantly expensive for what you got. I guess in India that's possible. And she really loved that experience. So there you go. There is a time and a place for a tour. But I think most of us agree that we are not about to hop on a Kon-Tiki tour of Europe for 30 countries in 20 days. So, yeah, we don't need to debate that too much, I don't think. So anyway, thanks so much for listening to episode 47 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. You can see links and all other information that you need at the show notes at notaballerina.com/47. And, of course, thank you so much to my wonderful guests. First up, we had Natasha Lester, and I've got a link to Natasha's website in the show notes. It's natashalester.com.au. And to her last year's book, A Kiss from Mr. Fitzgerald, set in New York. And her upcoming book, in fact, will be very close to being published by the time this episode goes live, Her Mother's Secret. Links in the show notes. And welcoming for the first time, Rachael Johns. So she's at rachaeljohns.com. And her Rachael is Rachael. I've put a link to one of Rachel's recent novels, The Patterson Girls, which is actually literally on my bedside table waiting to be read very soon. And finally, we chatted again with Emma Mann, and you can find Emma at The Vagabond Feminist at thevagabondfeminist.wordpress.com and also at flyingfoodieadventures.com. Now, I would love to see you as well in the Facebook group. Thanks so much to everyone who's been chatting away in there. It's so much fun. It's like, my people are there. So just look for Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook, or there's a link in the show notes as well. Also, you can get me on Twitter at Amanda Kendall and use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod. Look forward to speaking to you for the 1-year episode next week. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.